Welcome to Accelerate Science Now, where we sit down with innovators shaping policy, research, and industry to ask one big question. How do we make science move faster and work better for everyone? Today, I'm joined by Charles Yang, Executive Director of the Center for Industrial Strategy and an AI for Science Fellow at Renaissance Philanthropy. We dig into how AI is really changing the practice of science, not just through headline-grabbing discoveries, but through new tools and instruments that reshape how research actually gets done. We also talk about what industrial policy has to do with scientific competitiveness and what the biggest risks facing U.S. science are today. Enjoy the show. Today's guest is Charles Yang. He's the executive director of Center for Industrial Strategy, where he's building a bipartisan coalition in support of a renewed American industrial policy. He's also an AI for Science Fellow at Renaissance Philanthropy, focusing on autonomous experimentation. Previously, Charles worked at the U.S. Department of Energy as an AI and supply chain policy advisor. And Charles also writes actively about AI for science on Substack, including interviews with researchers and deep dives on how AI is changing the way we do science. So, Charles, thank you so much for joining us today.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So we like to get started inquiring if there was something early on in your childhood or earlier in your career that really sparked your interest in science and technology.
Yeah, I think growing up, I was really motivated by energy and climate. So when I went to college, I came in as a material science major because I wanted to discover, new batteries or new solar materials, help commercialize new energy technologies. But when I went to school out in the San Francisco Bay Area, I very quickly got bit by the AI bug that was happening even way back then, and that's when I started working at this intersection of AI for science, which has continued throughout my career.
Perfect. Lucky that you got into it so early on.
Yeah, it was quite fortuitous and
Yeah.
unexpected. It was yeah, unexpected in that I would have never thought I'd be someone who wrote code, if you had asked me much earlier in life, and here we all are.
Yeah, doing a great job at it. So did you go straight from your undergrad studies into a master's, or did you bump around a bit first?
Yeah, Berkeley, where I went to school, had a nice sort of combined bachelor's and master's program, and I was doing a lot of lab research when I was at Berkeley, so it made for a really natural transition. I was already working in several different labs, and one of them agreed to sort of host me for a master's where I got to spend a little bit more time doing some research.
Awesome. And what did you focus on there in your research?
Yeah. So for my master's in my research, I was working in a few different labs around AI and AI for science, but this particular one is a topic that's actually quite relevant now, which was around AI security. And so we were working on a federally sponsored competition actually through DARPA, through IARPA, which is the intelligence agency's DARPA style program. And they were trying to develop models that could detect if an AI had been hacked or backdoored. And so that was sort of the master's thesis. It was a very hard problem. I will say that, especially back then, but it's one that I know folks are still working on even now.
Yeah, definitely. Well, exciting to have been involved in that early on. And also, I don't think I'd heard of IARPA. There are so many different ARPAs. So great.
Yeah, there are quite a few of them. IARPA is definitely one that tries to keep a lower profile for
Yeah,
obvious
that,
reasons,
that makes
perhaps.
sense. All right. So after getting your master's, where did you head next?
Yeah, so I actually had a sort of a brief detour. I spent a summer at ARPA-E working on their tech to market program, which was really interesting to sort of see the sausage making at another ARPA, this one for energy, and was closer to sort of some of my original interest. But after that summer, I started as a machine learning engineer at an AI hardware startup. So we were building sort of a GPU, you could say, like a new kind of chip that could run AI models natively. So I spent like 2 years almost working there. We were building models that could run on our custom chip, which led to some very interesting problems, right? When you're a machine learning engineer and you're trying to build models and the chip you're working on is so new, like half the time the model breaks. So it's a problem. You have to deal with these kinds of problems that the vast majority of engineers were at that time working with those systems don't have to deal with because they're using a chip that is really commonplace already. So it had some fun, interesting problems to work on.
Yeah, fascinating. Were you able to bring sort of that kind of problem solving into any future roles from there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one really interesting theme that I see looking back is the first project I worked on when I was at that startup was one that was sponsored by the Department of Energy. So we had chips at one of the Department of Energy national labs, and we were working with their scientists to train our AI models on our own custom chip for the specific scientific problems that they were working on. And so DOE has sort of been a through line in that sense throughout my career, but also I think speaks to the national labs that we worked with are really quite early leaders on bringing some of the innovation in house and ensuring that it leads to scientific competitiveness.
Yeah, wow, really exciting. And I know you did eventually end up at the Department of Energy,
Yeah.
helping stand up their frontiers in AI for science, security, and technology initiatives. Can you talk about maybe some of the biggest challenges in driving, your work that you've done before and
Yeah.
bringing it to DOE?
Yeah, I mean, going into federal government, it's quite a different sort of place. I would say it's quite unique as a workplace environment, but it's one that I definitely enjoyed a lot. It was my first time working in a large organization. I'd only worked in research labs and startups before that, so that was definitely some of the challenges for me. And I would say to that point, the DOE is so large and vast, right? We are a very medium-sized agency, but have 17 national labs that we oversee, and getting everyone on the same page and figuring out what are we going to do about this AI thing that has burst onto the scene takes a lot of coordination and a lot of relationship building, but it's one that I was really excited about, especially again, given in hindsight, the sort of through line for a lot of my research and work up to that point.
Yeah, definitely. It's also just crazy to hear medium-sized agency, but they lead all of the national labs and
Yes.
do so much work. Yeah, really, really fascinating. So, do you think I know because so you'd spend time in startup, working at research labs. Do you think that there was anything that people in government or just generally people outside of those systems like misunderstand about how science at scale is happening?
Wow, that's a big question. One thing I think I'll just say what I've been thinking about. One thing I've been thinking about recently is I think especially in the West, we really love scientific discoveries as sort of the base unit. We imagine science advancing discovery by discovery, and that's certainly true to some extent. But I think when it comes to thinking about how AI impacts science, I think we lean too much on that model. So a lot of times people think, oh, AI will discover a new thing. And then we'll have advanced science. When in reality, I think the way science advances is much more complicated, right? Science is done by scientists, and the process by which your fellow peer scientists recognize and accept and incorporate a discovery into their science is quite complicated and quite social, actually, I would say. So there are many examples where scientists would claim to have discovered something like cold fusion or a new drug test or anything else. And later, sometimes years, sometimes months later, it would sort of turn out that that discovery wasn't the case or was not as big as thought, or that maybe the way they discovered it is not actually quite as impactful as originally conceived. And I think that's sort of something we need to think more carefully about when it comes to AI. Like, what does it mean for an AI to discover something? So we've already seen this a little bit where there are certain labs or organizations, there are a number of them. Sometimes they'll say, oh, AI discovered this new thing. And then someone else will later say, no, actually, you can find it in this paper or that paper, or it was tried and didn't work. And it still remains to be seen. I think what kind of process by which when an AI quote unquote discovers something, what does it mean for that to be accepted by the rest of the science community? So that's maybe one, I think, example at the very least I could give.
That's so fascinating. Yeah, it makes complete sense, and I know it's something you've written about in your
Yeah.
newsletter, and like how yeah, it's more than just discoveries, but also emphasizing the underlying instruments and ecosystems. How do you think like having that perspective versus the like AI's making discoveries
Yeah.
perspective, like what difference does that make for people to have those different perspectives?
Yeah. So one like alternative model I often propose for people trying to think about how AI will affect science is let's not think of AI as a scientist itself that is making discoveries and replacing humans. I mean, like I said earlier, I think it's not really helpful in a number of ways to think of it like that. So one alternative I like to propose is think of AI as a new tool, right? A new instrument that allows you to read more or understand more or see further than you could previously. And that perspective, I think, helps because that is another way by which science advances, right? When we have new instruments or new microscopes or new tools, we can suddenly make different kinds of discoveries or new kinds of discoveries or more discoveries that we couldn't otherwise. But it's an important aspect of the way by which science is done. And so, how does that like perspective matter beyond a new way of thinking about the world? Well, for one, science funding is obviously really important topic right now. And if we stop thinking about AI as just automating scientists and instead think of it as a new tool, then you might ask, well, how do we make sure more scientists have access to this tool? And we might
Mhm.
ask, who is integrating these tools into their workflows and how do we encourage that? So it sort of shifts the kinds of questions you ask. And I think it shifts the frame and some of the conversation around what is the role of science funding as well.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think another thing you've observed is some of the like most impactful scientific tools, such as AI now, weren't such like flashy breakthroughs, but really more durable infrastructure
Yeah.
investments. Can you think of a recent example of like a boring infrastructure, whether it's AI or not, that has really mattered a lot for science that people might not realize?
Yeah, that's a good question. One that's sort of top of mind because I'm traveling there in a little bit is the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, which is the world's largest particle accelerator, and that is a massive instrument, right? It's a multiple kilometers wide underground particle collider that allows physicists to see particles and high level energy physics that you can't see anywhere else in the world. There was a time 30, 40 years ago now where the US almost built a particle accelerator that of that scale, and we ultimately decided not to due to science funding cuts. So those are the kinds of, I mean, that's infrastructure of a national scale, right? And that sort of speaks to the perspective I had at DOE, where our national labs often do provide that kind of infrastructure, where the national labs have supercomputers, particle accelerators, foundries that act as infrastructure for the nation's scientists. And I think that's a really important role that they play. And that's sort of the kinds of investments that help advance science as well.
Got it. And so for something like this large scale particle collider,
Yeah.
what are some like real world examples of like
Yeah.
research or technologies that are coming out of that?
Yeah, so it's funny because when you talk to physicists, they're like, "Oh, we can see these super high energies, and we'll discover new subatomic particles, and it'll be really really cool." People are like, "Well, what does that get us?" Right? That's nice for you, but what does it mean for the rest of us? And oftentimes, I think we find a lot of it is serendipity, right? So when in the process of building these large particle colliders, I mean, LHC was one of the largest demand pulls for superconducting magnets because you use superconducting magnets to change the trajectory of these really fast particles. Now, superconducting magnets are really important for nuclear fusion, where nuclear fusion startups are relying on sort of the same components that were used for the Large Hadron Collider. Um, so that's sort of one example of just how that's not even a discovery, right? That's just like in the process of building
Yeah,
these massive tools, we develop techniques that were useful in more real world and practical
fascinating.
applications.
Yeah, so not even the tool itself, but just like in building it, you're
Yeah.
making new discoveries, new impact. Yeah, really exciting. Well, I'd love to switch gears a little bit and talk about your current work at the Center for Industrial Strategy. So, I think it might be helpful for listeners who may not be aware. Can you explain like what the ties of industrial policy really are to AI and science?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll start maybe with this, just the science part, right?
Hmm.
So a lot of times we talk about basic science funding, basic science research, and usually the motivation is that those scientific discoveries will help advance U.S. economic security or economic goals, right? Where we discover new batteries or new materials or new drugs, and those become companies that create jobs and create, globally competitive products for the world. Why so that's sort of how industrial policy, I think, bridges that gap where we're asking, okay, we're doing all this science funding, but we're not seeing some of the companies and benefits for American workers that were promised. And why is that? Well, oftentimes it's because the US is a world leader in basic research and basic science, and those discoveries are sometimes then essentially shipped abroad and sort of are not benefiting the US. Rare earth magnets sort of being a great example of this, where 40 years ago, the US was a world leader in rare earth magnet manufacturing and refining. But China made a lot of investments both on the industrial side, but also in the science side and understanding how to process those kinds of chemicals. And now they've essentially completely dominated that supply chain. So that's how I see how science funding and industrial policy relate. Right, sort of one feeds the other, and we need to make sure that both are working together to support the American economy and the American people. AI, I think, is a really interesting new sort of technology that we now have that can help accelerate both scientific discoveries, but hopefully also how we commercialize those and keep those capabilities in the U.S. so that they ultimately aren't just papers that scientists write, but ultimately companies and jobs for Americans.
Got it. So is there like if you could, talk to Congress and have them pass a bill tomorrow on industrial policy, like maybe like the top like 2 or 3 wish list items,
Yeah.
what do you think those new policies to have in the US would be?
Wow. Yeah. That's a big question as well. Um, I would say one simple answer that it isn't about a specific industry, but it's simply about the
Mhm.
pace at which the United States is able to build things. I think when you look at the software industry, right, where the AI boom came out of, they build so quickly. For better or for worse. And it's because they're able to build sort of at the pace at which they're able to ship code. Whereas when you look at hardware, when you look at manufacturing and industrials, oftentimes there's so much cumbersome regulation that hinders that development. And so there's a lot of discussion right now in Congress around permitting reform. I think that's sort of an example of something where it's not about subsidizing or incentivizing, though those are also important tools for supporting, I think, really key industries. But it's just about making it easier to build things in America while still balancing, safety and environmental concerns, which are obviously still important. But I think I would say we've probably leaned a little bit too far in one direction at the cost of a lot of these industries that support American jobs and American economic development.
Right, and you can definitely see the real world impacts, like, happening now, as you were saying, and the difference between 4 years ago. Do you think there is maybe a most underappreciated lesson from past industrial strategies that could apply to, science, AI today?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think maybe one really underrated one, I think, is sort of the role of the government in driving adoption of these technologies and processes. So, one area that I've studied in the past year is really quite niche, but it's about weather forecasting. And when we first started using computers in the 50s to forecast the weather, there were a lot of the same questions that we have today around automation, around, who's going to spend the money and do this. And what we did in the 50s is the US government took a really strong lead, and some of the first computers that IBM ever built were for the US government to forecast the weather. And that obviously has tons of benefits for the American farmers, obviously, and American people, and better understanding, what the weather is going to look like the next day is really important for a lot of sectors. And there, it was the government that took a key role in ensuring early adoption of that and securing a public benefit based on a new technology at the time, the electronic computer. I think there's a really similar thing now with AI. AI for weather forecasting being one sort of obvious example, but there are a lot of others where there are a lot of public benefits, I think, from this technology that are not being realized because we haven't really seen that robust and vigorous federal investment in use of this technology for the broader American people, as opposed to companies are obviously being very vigorous in adopting it for their own benefit, which is also great. But the government, I think, has an important role to play as well.
Yeah, really great point there. Great illustration. I now want to look up and see what I think it was like the Farmer's Almanac, but how did they even do weather forecasting before computers? I
A lot of
hadn't really
math,
thought about it.
I think, a
I
lot of
know.
hand, rote math.
Really crazy. But yeah, and I mean, it's also just exciting to think about like where could we get in the next few decades and look back and say like, oh wow, how did we do that before? But great point that so much of that is like government investment and making sure that that can happen.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it now is storytelling, right? We've forgotten both how we did it before, and I think that is shaping how we think about what the present and the future could look like with this new technology. I've honestly, personally, a lot of optimism about how it can all pan out, but maybe that's maybe that's just me.
No, it's great. So you've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about where the U.S. still has structural advantages in AI for science. Where do you think those advantages are maybe the strongest, and where is the U.S. maybe surprisingly behind?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think the US has tons of advantages. I mean, first, we're home to the world leading AI companies here in the US, like Google and OpenAI, Anthropic, and others. And the one benefit of that is that there are people using these models in the US who are able to accelerate their scientific workflows. And compared to the rest of the world, certainly compared to China, for instance, which currently does not have access to those models for now. That's, I think, a huge advantage that I know everyone sort of talks about. But even myself, when I sort of use some of these models for my own work, it is, I mean, astounding how much more quickly I can get work done. So I think that's a huge underrated benefit. The other I would say is just talent. America, I think for now, is still home to and the beacon for people who want to work hard and who want to try new things. And I think
Mhm.
that's just really underappreciated. That even in the age of planes and all this stuff, for someone who want to pick up their bag and move all the way across the world to the world's best place to do something new, which is I think the United States, that is still a huge advantage that we have. I think one challenge that is I don't know how underrated it is, but is the I would just say general uncertainty, right? I know people like to talk about the funding numbers or other stuff like that, and we can all sort of argue what the right number should be or what the right policy should be. But what I would say at an even higher level, perhaps, is just uncertainty is not helpful, right? It's when you're trying to make plans for yourself, when you're trying to think about what you want to work on, when there is a lot of uncertainty, it's really hard to make those decisions. And I think that's true even for scientists, right? Who are people at the end of the day. They have jobs and families they need to take care of. And if they have a lot of uncertainty about basic things like that, it's much harder for them to do their research and their work. So I would say, besides sort of a lot of the more detailed stuff, just general uncertainty isn't helpful.
Yeah, that's a really interesting answer. And do you think that's something that might be, causing us to lose some of that talent? People like moving overseas to somewhere where they think there is more certainty
Yeah.
in the future of their career?
Yeah, I mean, China is very actively trying to poach scientists from the best institutions, most of which are in the U.S. And they'll offer them 10 years of guaranteed research funding and a visa that they don't have to worry about, right? So when the competitor is saying, "Look, we'll pay for everything you want to do, and you don't have to worry about your visa or immigration status, and you can come here and you'll have a great institution to work at." That's a really compelling deal if
Mhm.
your current situation has a lot of uncertainty right now. If the U.S. has even slightly better of a deal to offer where there is available research funding, where there is a certainty about immigration status and talent management, then I think we can be competitive. But when there's a lot of uncertainty on our end, that creates opportunities for others. And I'll say it's not just China, but other countries are also trying to take advantage of this and see the opportunity for them to get some of the great talent that we have here.
Yeah. Well, scary point. Hopefully, we can work on that. I definitely also want to talk about your work as a fellow at Renaissance Philanthropy. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I think you all have already had Tom on, who's
Yeah,
I
Tom
guess
Khalil.
our CEO. So hopefully he's given you some of the spiel about the awesome work that Renaissance Philanthropy is doing. My work is specifically focused on AI for science, and even within that, a lot of my focus has been around autonomous labs, which is how do we bring robots and AI models into the actual physical science lab to automate closed loop experiments. And again, I sort of like to push back against the we're automating scientists. I don't think we're doing that. I think we're enabling scientists to do much more of the work that they want to do while sort of getting rid of the more rote and difficult tasks. So that's where a lot of my work has been focused on. It's a really fun place because you get to sort of step back and think about, what do we need to do? And then how do we make it happen from any sort of number of perspectives, be it policy, be it in, funding, be it sort of companies that need to be built. And so that's one of the great things about being at Renaissance Philanthropy. And that's some of our focus right now, at least for
Yeah,
me.
really exciting. So it sounds like you're definitely working on some of the big picture stuff about it. Have you gotten to like observe any specific experiments? Like where exactly are the robots involved? What's
Yeah.
going on the ground?
Yeah, no, it's been fun visiting a bunch of different research labs, both in the US and some in Canada as well, who are really developing some of these systems within their labs to accelerate, for instance, the discovery of new catalysts that can help us process chemicals more efficiently and cleanly, or new battery materials, or new carbon capture adsorbents. Um, and I will just say it's just personally really cool to see a robot doing science.
Yeah, I think for anyone.
So would highly recommend. And we are actually I'm actually working with some folks on how do we again do more storytelling and create the visual appeal of what's actually going on in some of these labs because it's quite I would say underreported on the sort of
Hmm.
work that's happening in that space. We've organized a workshop earlier this year around autonomous science instruments and brought together a bunch of researchers who are building their own tooling to collaborate with private sector partners. And I think we'll be doing some more work in that kind of space as well.
Awesome. In your experience there so far, is there maybe like a piece of the lab or a piece within the experiment that you're seeing like robots have been the most helpful?
Yeah, it's usually when you have to do this sort of same task, a repeatable task really often. So one really common example, right, is if you have to pipette, move some fluid
Hmm.
around, and you have like three different types of fluids, and you need to mix them in different proportions. You could, have an undergrad or yourself do that, but that's the sort of stuff that's really easy to automate. The other really interesting thing is when for these research groups who are focused on building autonomous labs, when they ask, okay, we want to do this set of experiment and we want to use robot arm to do it. that changes the way they design the experiment and sort of how they set it up. And so it's
Oh,
sort of leading to
interesting.
new workflows because they're looking at it from the perspective, what is the easiest thing to automate rather than, okay, I'm a human, how should I go about and do this? And so that's led to some really interesting sort of, I think, changes in how we do science. And I think that speaks to the broader conversation we've been having, right? About what is the impact of AI? It's not just going to be, oh, we go 0 to 1, we finish a whole discovery end to end. It's going to be changing the way we think about experiments and do science itself.
Right. Wow. So fascinating. If you could have a robot in your house to help you with one monotonous task, what do you think it would be?
That's a good question. Watering plants, actually.
Watering plants. That's a very
Yeah, I
precise
mean,
one.
we have a decent number of plants, and you have to remember to water them. Each plant has a
Mhm,
different amount. Actually, someone really should do this. This is actually I not thought about this at all. Each plant has a different watering schedule, different
mhm.
watering amount. You have to sort of check for its health in different ways, and that feels like something someone else
No,
could.
this is actually I'm totally on board. I feel like I've killed even the plants that are supposed to be the easiest to take care of, so I would definitely sign up for the plant watering
There you go.
robot.
You heard it here first.
Yeah. Oh, perfect. But I definitely also want to talk, about your newsletter, ML for Sci. What inspired you to start that?
Yeah, good question, and that goes all the way back, to when I was in college. This was when Substack was still quite early, I will say, and, I was working in 2 different research labs, one in mechanical engineering at Berkeley, and then one up the hill at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and I was enjoying doing this sort of research, working at this intersection of AI and different scientific domains, and I wanted to just read more papers, and so the way I went about forcing myself to read more papers was, I'm gonna write about these papers, and so I started this Substack
Oh.
almost 7, 8 years ago now, when I was a student, and that was sort of my first foray into really publicly writing, and it was really helpful because a lot of the folks who I even work with now who are researchers and scientists, I first started reading their papers way back when I first started writing this Substack, so that was the origin story. It's evolved sort of beyond that, but that was how it originally started. It was just a way for me to read more papers.
Wow, what a great way to get yourself to learn. That's amazing. So you
I would recommend it, by the way, for anyone who, writing more, I mean, and I mean, reading papers also good, but, I think that process of starting to write more very early has led to a lot of, I think, sort of how I think now.
Oh, yeah, and I think it's really a great way to make sure you understand something is if you're able to explain it to someone
Exactly,
else. So, yeah,
exactly.
amazing. Well, you've definitely been able to have a lot of learn a lot of exciting things, but also have a lot of amazing conversations in the work you've done. Is there any view that maybe you had, like, at the start of your career when you started your Substack that has only strengthened with everything you've learned? And, like, on the opposite end, any view that
Yeah.
you've had, like, a total about face on?
Yeah, well, it's funny, I remember almost, I wanna say 5 years ago, I wrote a piece on how AI models can be thought of as particle colliders because they are like science infrastructure and science tools that allow you to see further. They can, at the time and still to some degree now, be very expensive, but they can provide a lot of value for scientists, and I think that's sort of one theme, we've carried forward even to this conversation. So that was from, a perspective I developed 5, 6 years ago. One change I think has been, I had sort of always underrated the, pace of large language model development
Hmm.
for coding, um, and even this past couple weeks, I think I've had the very visceral, like, "Wow, this can do a lot of a lot of my coding work in particular," which
Wow.
has been tremendous. Um, I still think there are other sorts of areas where it will struggle or where that particular model is not necessarily the most suited for solving scientific problems, but on coding and actually also in math, sort of the GPT 5.2 Pro, that results that have come out for some of these new math problems has been really surprising even in the past month or so. So that's something that I think a lot of other folks have always had really high expectations for, and one that I was sort of more skeptical of, which I've come around on, I would say, in the past month even.
Wow. And things are constantly changing. You
Yeah.
mentioned that you think there are some problems that you still are
Yeah.
skeptical it will be able to help on. What do you think those are?
Oh, some very simple ones. When we just think about like what kind of data are we working with, right? So these large language models are really good with tokenized data, so essentially text, anything that you can put in as characters, which is why it's so great with code and math. I think where it'll struggle is where data doesn't look like that. So one good example is for chemical compound property prediction, right? For drug discovery or for new small organic molecules. Um, when you look at a molecule, it's like a graph, right? It's like dots and at a very simple level, it's dots and lines that are connecting them. And so there, the type of model that is used is quite different. So when you look at what AlphaFold is really doing under the hood, even though they sort of use this alpha terminology for a bunch of different models, it's quite different than like what Gemini is doing. And it's designed in a quite different way, even though it's made by the same company. Even the teams that work on it are the teams look quite different. They have much more science heavy background, and the model itself ultimately looks different. So that's just one example where when the data isn't exactly easily tokenizable in
Hmm.
sort of native representation, you will probably use a different kind of model.
Interesting. Well, on that note, and also I was checking out your Substack today and saw that you just launched, I think yesterday, a new project
Yeah.
called Bench Signal. Tell us about that. Also, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Yeah, it's sort of one of a number of side projects that this perspective of science advancing through new instruments has led me down. In particular, so when you look at people talk a lot about science papers and whether or not a science paper represents a new discovery and how impactful it is, which is always sort of this discovery first framework. But as soon as you start thinking about science advancing through new instruments, then you might start asking, what types of instruments are people using? When do they start using new instruments, and what does that look like? And so what bench signal is we went through a bunch of open access papers, a couple million, I'll say, just for order of magnitude, went through a
A
couple million.
bunch is very, I wouldn't have guessed a couple million.
Right, right. Someone says I brought home a bunch of apples, and it's a
Yeah,
couple million.
yeah.
Yeah, so we use I will say we use AI to sort of scrape the papers and
Mhm.
extract out what instruments and also what instrument vendors each paper used, and from that we can now reconstruct, when are new science instruments becoming adopted, and then
Hmm.
what we haven't done yet is we can look at even a country level or an institution level. If someone is a first mover at a specific institution and brings in a new instrument, does that shape how that new instrument is adopted? Do different countries adopt different instruments or different instrument vendors? How does that shape the marketplace? There's even sort of an industrial policy lens, right? Thermo Fisher is a $200 billion American science instrument manufacturing company. Their market share in the US versus in China is different at a very high level. What are the sort of factors that shape that? And how does that shape how we think about science and scientific competitiveness? So, um, this is sort of us just putting out the first initial analysis we've done on the data, but I think there's going to be a lot more. And it all came from starting from this perspective of what happens when we think about science through the lens of new instruments.
Wow, really exciting. Do you have any like goals of what you're hoping the impact of Bench Signal might be?
Yeah, well, I'll say like I think the goal for how we think about the goal for thinking about science through the lens of new instruments is really shifting a lot of these conversations right around what is AI going to do? How does science funding impact it? Because I think this new perspective does bring a sort of different approach to a lot of those
Mhm.
questions. And so, one, I guess, if I had to go really, really aim really big here, there have only been a few Nobel Prizes that have been awarded to scientists who discover or develop a new instrument, like a new type of science instrument or new type of microscope. And I think we should have a few more for scientists who are building those kinds of tools. So I would say that would be our goal. Where if we could demonstrate, a new tool that someone developed had a huge impact on a scientific field that was sort of being underreported on or sort of under recognized, that we might be able to shift the even conversation all the way up at the Nobel Prize level. They've awarded, I think, most recently two or three in the past 10 years, which is pretty good. But I think we can do a lot more in sort of advancing that.
Yeah, well, what a great goal. How exciting to, even beyond that, just be shedding light on something that has been so important and maybe often overlooked.
That's the goal. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. Okay, well, so you've worked across government, startups, writing strategy for industrial policy. And when you look back, is there maybe like some common questions that you've been trying to answer across all of these roles?
Common question. Well, I think one question that I'm quite motivated by, it leads me maybe to be a little bit too sort of broad in my focus, is I think I just like understanding how the world works, like understanding
Mm.
how different institutions operate, how they change. I think that's sort of what led me down again this rabbit hole of science and instruments. Is I thought how most people were thinking about how science works were missing something, and that sort of just kept leading me down this different path. Um, I would say that's sort of my general motivation, one of my general motivations. I think that's sort of what's led me across all these different sorts of sectors where I feel like once I understand how this one company or organization operates, I'm really interested in understanding how a different ecosystem and how they all fit together. And that's sort of been the synthesis work maybe of the past couple years now that I've been in a few different places, which has been really interesting.
Yeah, so cool. Is there anything that you're looking to next? Is the next thing you want to figure out how it works?
Um, I think there's still a lot more to unpack on the science instrument space. I think how it works as an industry, how science instrument industry interrelates with the academic researchers, and how that they both relate with for industrial customers and use cases. One, I guess, sort of question I've been thinking on over the past week, just as an example, is everyone talks about the very famous Bell Labs, the corporate R&D lab that has sort of fallen from its heyday. And one thesis I've been exploring is this idea that actually a lot of these corporate R&D labs invented a lot of the instruments that we now use. So not just Bell Labs, but HP Labs or the Intel and or IBM R&D labs. A lot of these big companies back in the day had big R&D labs, and they invented a lot of the science instruments we use today. And so now that those are all gone, that leads to the next question, which is how has that impacted or maybe hurt the way that we do science because we don't have that type of organization in the ecosystem? I don't know what the answer is, but it's sort of a new, and maybe the answer is it doesn't matter at all, and it's not a good question. And that's sort of the other trick, right? Is to
That's
know what's
something
a
to
good
figure
question.
out too.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, maybe something that I don't know if this is even a question that totally makes sense. Do you have a favorite instrument that you have studied?
Do I have a favorite science instrument? So right now I've been. This answer is going to change in probably not too long. Currently, since you asked right now, I've been really interested in this instrument called the scanning transmission electron microscope. Transmission electron microscope has been around for a really long time. The basic idea is you shoot an electron at a sample and you see how it deflects the electron, and that will tell you something about the shape of the sample that you're looking at. What scanning transmission electron microscope does is instead of just shooting a bunch of electrons at a sample and seeing how they're deflected, you put the electron gun or the electron probe really close to the sample itself. And then when you shoot an electron, you don't just measure did the electron go, deflect left a little bit or deflect right. You get what's called an entire diffraction pattern, which is when we think about electrons as waves rather than particles, because that's what happens when you start letting them interact that closely. And you can actually get a ton of information from that, but we haven't totally figured out how to extract that sort of information out of the enormous amounts of data these instruments are now generating from this new technique. So that's something I've been exploring over the past couple months. It's been really interesting because it's a new science instrument that is generating an enormous amount of data. So it seems like there's something for AI to be doing here, but it's still quite early days where we're
Mhm.
figuring out how do we actually use AI for this particular instrument and draw more insight out of it.
Awesome. Sounds like a really cool instrument. Do you say you think your answer is going to change shortly because there's something new coming out you're excited about, or just because so often you're finding something new that you're really excited about?
Yeah, historically for myself, I often my interests shift, but this has been one that I've been on for a while, and I think will continue to be an interest, at least for myself.
Awesome. Well, just wrapping up, you've worked across so many different areas, as you've mentioned. Is there any advice that you would give to an early career researcher or technologist who wants to work at the intersection of science and policy and AI?
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier, just write. I think writing is it
Mhm.
has it. You are, in myself included, are like, and I'm not writing enough. Right? You could always be writing more, and there's probably some more value to be gained out of it. That's one really simple answer. I think another is talk to different kinds of people with different perspectives. I find oftentimes, especially in tech, it's quite an insular community that looks at itself and understands itself quite well, but is not as interested as it should be in understanding how the rest of the world work or relies upon very simple models of that. And so I think just being open minded and curious and talking to a lot of different people, especially early on, I think is something that helped inform a lot of my perspectives.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I think, in any field, being curious is probably the best thing that
There you go.
someone can be. Well, thank you so much, Charles. It was really great getting to learn from you about your really interesting career path. Can't wait to see all that comes next. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks again for having me.
You've been listening to Accelerate Science Now. I'm your host, Adeline DeYoung. The show is produced by Kindred Subjects, Accelerate Science Now, and Seed AI. Our executive producers are Josh New and Austin Carson. Special thanks to Kevin King for editing and production. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.